Morning, everyone. Welcome to our special virtual event looking at ONC Fast updates as well as a TEFCA stakeholder panel. It's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today, John Kelly, Principal Business Advisor with EdFX, WEDI board member, and the WEDI Education Committee co-chair.
Good morning, Mike. Thank you, Michael, and good morning to everybody. We welcome you to our sessions today. Two sessions integrated to some degree, but on two really different topics. Our first session, we're going to be looking at the work of the FAST, the Fire at Scale Task Force, sponsored under the ONC, bringing together a number of thought leaders and technologists and stakeholders from across the country to work on how to figure out using fire at scale. As you're all very aware, the CMS mandates have encouraged now pretty much every payer and provider in the country to have a fire gateway at the edge of their enterprise. So how do we start using that? How do we start leveraging it in a way that we can really achieve large volumes of data going across many to many connections across the whole country? So that's about creating a national network based on fire. What we are going to talk about this morning with our speakers. Next slide, please, Michael. Paul Oates, the head of IT Mergers and Acquisitions Practice at Evernorth, Patrick Murda from Humana, and Stefan Kanya, who's the Senior Advisor to the Deputy National Coordinator for Health IT, holding the Innovation Portfolio Lead position as well. They are going to give us an update on where FAST is, what the state of the fire technology at scale is looking like right now, and where we're going from here. The second part of the morning, or the early afternoon, I guess, on the East Coast, we're going to have a TEFCA industry stakeholder panel. We're going to have three different perspectives. It's a perspectives panel, I think, is the way we're best describing it, with Hans Buitendijk, Director of Interoperability Strategy at Cerner, Tim Pletcher, the Executive Director of MyHIN, and Daniel Lloyd, Vice President, Private Market Innovations and Quality Initiatives at AHIP. And they'll offer kind of three different perspectives on the recent news about FAST and the comment period that we're in the middle of right now. Next slide, Michael. I'd like to do just a little bit of housekeeping first. We are going to take questions at the end of each of the sessions, and we would like you to please put your questions in the chat feature of Zoom. And then we will relay those questions on to the panelists for both of the sessions at the end of the presentation period. We'll be sending an email of the questions to folks and the answers that don't get covered during the session out to the attendees. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Paul, Stefan, and Patrick to talk a little bit about FAST. Gentlemen.
Great. Quick mic check. Can you hear me okay?
Perfect.
Great. Well, thank you again to the WEDI board and WEDI leadership team for inviting us to come provide an update on the Fire Scale Task Force. I know that many of you have been involved along the journey and included in some of the SME sessions and workshops and things we've had over the past almost 3 years or so. But also I know that some of you, this might be new information to you. So hopefully this will be a good level set update for everyone, because there really has been quite a lot of momentum and activity that has happened over the course of the last 6 months to a year. So with that, today's session is going to be, it says ONC Fast. ONC provides kind of the convening role to bring together a number of different diverse industry stakeholders to look at shared challenges to scalability of fire. And really it's led by the industry when it comes to the content, the direction, the challenges identified, et cetera. And a good portion of that is coordinated by our chief architects who we have with us today, our co-chief architects, Mr. Patrick Murda and Paul Oates. They're part of our executive steering committee, as well as our, I'm trying to see here. Is Melissa sharing her screen or is this?
Yeah, Melissa's sharing.
Okay, good. Yeah. Okay, good. I just was confused. I was trying to advance and then move. Okay. So again, these are the two gentlemen really that have kind of been helping guide the work alongside of our executive steering committee and our coordinating committee. Next slide, please, Melissa. As always, with the Fire Scale Task Force, we got a lot of for-profit private competitors involved, especially the payers. So we always go over an antitrust notice to make sure that we're not in violation of any federal and state antitrust laws. We don't talk about price premiums, et cetera, so we leave all that out and really just focus on what are those shared technical challenges. Next slide. So for today's presentation, we're going to cover in a pretty high-speed fashion over the next 45 minutes or so, a summary of what is FAST, an overview of FAST work to date, and then spend a lot of the time on the action plan snapshot, really focusing on where the current solutions are and how you can get involved. Next slide. So what is FAST? I already gave you a little bit of a primer to it, but essentially, well, we provide a space to bring together quite a lot of people in different areas of healthcare and healthcare technology, and really looking at identifying those HL7 FAST fire scalability gaps and come up with those possible solutions, analysis that'll address those current barriers, and ultimately, how can we accelerate the fire adoption at scale? Next slide. If you're wondering, isn't that what Da Vinci does, or that's what Gravity does, or these other accelerators? The answer is yes and no. They do work on helping to kind of get fire to run at scale within certain stakeholder categories. So if you see on the left-hand side here, there's a list of a number of fire accelerators. There's a discussion of other ones being spun up, and there's a lot of other initiatives out there that are fire focused. And these groups are looking at functional use cases, or what I like to call specific data for specific purposes, the exchange of that. Da Vinci focused on payers and providers, Argonaut being focused on provider to provider, Karen looking at the consumer from the key perspective, Gravity being focused on social determinants of health, Codex, cancer care, and Vulcan around clinical trials. And there's also talk of other accelerators, like I said, being spun up. But again, when they go to run those use cases at scale, there's a number of technical challenges they run into. Are you still hearing me?
Yep, perfect.
Sorry, my Zoom canceled out, and luckily the phone line is still on. So my screen is reconnecting. I don't know what the issue is here. But in the center, there are those shared technical challenges, and it's really at that point where FAST focuses in a comprehensive way. There are other efforts out there, Commonwealth Care Quality, looking at some of these challenges as well and providing some of the network for exchange of data. But ultimately, what we're trying to do is come up with those common scalability approaches from a technical infrastructure standpoint, and we call those infrastructure use cases. These issues are in that center box. You're looking at patient and provider identity management, directory services, version identification, scaling challenges, exchange, process metadata, testing, conformance, certification, security. So these things are agnostic to all of the functional use cases on the left, as far as no matter what the situation is, you should have to deal with these problems in the middle. And if we all get on some common scalability approaches for those, the idea is that everything on the left can run at scale by the support of everything in the middle, and ultimately getting to widespread adoption to the right. Next slide. And I'm hoping you're at the next slide because I can't see it. But for next slide, what we're talking about here is a matter of how we're organized. And I'll just quickly mention there's 3 key layers that meet regularly as far as our official FAST membership. In the center, the group that meets the most frequently and does the most of the heavy lifting in between other meetings are our Tiger teams. We have 7 of them focused on those same technical challenge areas that I mentioned. Those are usually anywhere from about 10 to 15 members per group with those subject matter expertise. In the middle layer, you've got the coordinating committee, which meets on a monthly basis and helps guide that center. And then on the outside, you've got executive C-suite level leadership from all the participating members in the inner 2 layers. Those representatives at a senior level who meet about 4 or 5 times a year to provide coordination and guidance to the work as well. All of that is then shared with kind of the more informal membership, which is kind of an open community or technical learning community that we have. We've got a LinkedIn group of about 600 plus, and then we also have a number of other subject matter experts that don't have time for a 2-week, biweekly meeting regimen, but are willing to meet with us for, say, 6 hours at a time to do a deep dive and really pick apart the solutions and make sure that we're on the right path. So we engage with, I think, about 90 plus subject matter experts in those areas as well. And then we try to do everything as transparent as we can. So we have an open public Confluence page where everything is shared publicly, and try to provide updates through HL7 webinars, WEDI webinars like this, and many other industry webinars. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Paul Oates, who's going to talk a little bit about the why. Paul?
Thank you, Stephen. Good morning, everybody. Wanted to talk a little bit about the motivation for having the Fire at Scale Task Force. Right now, infrastructure is a largely a point-to-point exercise for fire. When we started getting involved in fire, all of us realized that following the lead of other industries, there's usually a shared and set of operating principles and infrastructure that is in place in order to scale RESTful APIs. In the case of fire today, Party A on the right-hand side of this page and Party B on the left-hand side of this page in a B2B transaction have to essentially pave their own pathway. If every entity, health plan, partner, care delivery organization, does that across every other, the amount of pathways in the middle of this picture is going to get very hard to manage. Plus, the time it takes simply to set up access to an API today is not sustainable. So we put our heads together and said, what would we want this to look like? And since this is an audience that's familiar with networks, you're not going to be surprised by the answer. What we want this to look like on this page is a common infrastructure and a set of common rules of the road for the info highway that fire will use to communicate in a dynamic way across the industry, so that everybody knows how to exchange an API transaction with their partner on a dynamic basis without necessarily having to ask permission to do so before invoking the API. We think if we do this, healthcare will move to a modern, interoperable API, RESTful API-based infrastructure, and interoperability will continue to take off, especially as consumers and patients access more of their information, and as care delivery, financial organizations, payers, health plans all work together on value-based care. So what does it look like in order to build a scalable info highway for fire? So let's talk a little bit about what we thought the key pieces are that structured our work. Let's go forward to the high-level pathway for a fire transaction. So this slide's a bit of an eye chart, but I ask you to study it a bit with me and perhaps use it in your own organizations to explain why this is an ecosystem challenge that requires us to have some shared infrastructure. So look at the top of this diagram. On the left, in this use case, we have a patient who visits a primary care physician. The primary care physician needs some information from a health plan. And on the right-hand side, the health plan or payer receives that request and provides the information. Now, you can replace the top example here with anything you want. Care delivery to care delivery, health plan to health plan, provider care delivery to health plan. It doesn't matter. The point is, Party A and Party B want to use a RESTful API transaction through the FHIR content standards in order to exchange information. The first thing that somebody is going to do in order to invoke a FHIR-based API under the number 1 on this pathway is look up where that partner's API or FHIR endpoint is. Well, the problem is we don't have a place to look up that endpoint. And if you have to spend the time to collect endpoints for every partner that you want to do business with, it could be very onerous. That was the first barrier we came up with. Second and third, there is some mechanics around how to make sure that the transaction is properly formed. And that's definitely part of FHIR. But I want to call out number 4, which is when you go to exchange a transaction, say between a care manager at a health plan and a care manager in an integrated delivery system, we better make sure we're talking about the same patient. Health plans tend to use ID numbers on cards. Care delivery organizations tend to use medical record numbers. So those two parties better agree on who's crosswalking the identity dynamically on the fly and what are the rules of the road to do that matching. That's what number 4 is, to make sure we're talking about the same match. Then on 5A and 5B, I want to call out the aspect of security. So we know where the FHIR endpoint is, and we want to access it. We have a need to do so. And we know who the patient is, we figured that out, but do we have permission to see or use that function or information? Nursing staffs across health plans and care delivery organizations can talk about patients. I, as a technologist, am not allowed to. So we need a strong dynamic security framework that wraps around this entire thing. We also added, which we're going to talk about today, some additional content around exchanging FHIR in multiple partner networks, and we're going to talk about that. So these are the barriers we came up with that we want to solve. Next page. So we created a structure to propose solutions and start to drive them as an industry to scale FHIR as an integrated network across the country so that trust networks and networked enablement can happen in markets, in states, in business relationships, and in patient care relationships. So this slide summarizes the current Tiger teams. We have a directory and scale team, which has 3 activities going on around the ability to look up a FHIR API. We have an identity management in the green on the bottom left, a team looking at the matching. Bottom right, we have a team looking at looking at security and for registration, authentication, authorization. We also working my way around the clock here, counterclockwise. We talked about testing and certification, which we may not get to today a lot, but there's a lot of sandbox and testing discussion happening across all the HL7 FHIR accelerators, including us. And then a solution for intermediary exchange. So what we're going to do now, myself and Patrick Murdo, who I'm very happy was able to join us today, is to talk through these solutions, but want to make sure that you understand heading into the solutions, we're talking about them individually, but they really form a conceptual integrated architecture for exchanging FHIR. Find the API, crosswalk the patient, make sure you're secure, manage the hops across different intermediaries, and exchange data. So the ability to do this is a package of solutions in an integrated architecture. And since this is a WEDI-sponsored discussion, a lot of us who are familiar with WEDI and the work in WEDI and the transaction work over the last 20 years or so or more also probably appreciates the need for an integrated architecture to be able to define transactions, route transactions, and make sure they're returned. So that's the same similar kind of approach we took for FHIR to build that kind of process. So what we're going to do now is go through a couple of the key solutions, and then Stefan will return us back to how you can get involved. So Patrick and I are going to tag team this a little bit. First one we want to talk about is the National Healthcare API or directory. So as I said, the barrier is, where do you go look up a FHIR endpoint? How do you determine what endpoint to use? That's what this page essentially is asking. In the interest of time, I'll cut to the next slide, which talks about the solution. And it's a technology and process solution that this Tiger team is working on. So I want to focus on first on the soup can in the middle of the diagram, the validated healthcare endpoint directory. What we are proposing and pushing and working on right now as an articulated solution through HL7 is to specify and build a single source FHIR API healthcare directory. So everyone uses the same source of information. Now notice I said source. I didn't say physical copy. We also realized to scale, we don't want the entire country accessing the same API repository. So we're providing on the bottom right, the federated healthcare endpoint directory, a way for entities like many of us on the phone here to obtain the endpoint data that's managed centrally and federate it for access. If you're Care Quality or Commonwealth, you may want a copy. If you're a commercial entity, you may want a copy of it. And that will help us scale. But we all understand that the data is going to be consistent because it's sourced from a common place. Now back to that endpoint directory. How do we build a common place? The first thing we want to do is define the directory. So there is a project moving through HL7 right now to continue the work of the validated healthcare directory and update it to include these endpoints and any specifics around access paths. Point 2, we need a way for healthcare organizations to contribute data and attest to its validity. Those are the sections on the upper left of this diagram. to be able to contribute, make sure that every physician and others, other care delivery, other healthcare entities that I talked about earlier, have a mechanism to contribute their endpoint, whether that endpoint is on their premise in their integrated living network, whether it's in the cloud in an EMR provider, whether it is on a server in their data room, doesn't matter. Where is it and how do you get to it? So there'll be a process, and the other projects moving to HL7 are defining how do you contribute this data, validate it, and how do you select from it. Over time, we will be working across the industry to define exactly how this is going to get built, whether we'll augment current directories or that we'll start fresh. That's being actively talked about. But the good news is that this work is moving through HL7 to define how this is going to function. So that's step one in the process. Next page, let's talk about the next barrier and the next solution that we came up with. I'll wait for the slide to advance, or did we? There we go. So I want to pass it to Patrick to talk about how do we make sure that the exchange between two parties is dynamic yet secure. So Patrick, I'm going to pass it to you.
Yeah, thanks again, Paul, and welcome again, everyone, to our READY discussion today. So as I go through this solution, and I've got one I'm going to go through in a few minutes as well, given the fact that we're kind of within the context of TEFCA, I do want to provide some context of what we're doing from a FAST perspective as it relates to the solutions that Stefan kicked off and Paul's been driving to, but also, provide some TEFCA, context as well, so that we over time can understand that what we're all trying to do from a healthcare ecosystem perspective should really be complementary to each other. And as we bring solutions forth from a FAST perspective, how do we reuse those across the entire ecosystem? So the one I'm going to cover relatively quickly here is basically the security solution. And the barrier that we are trying to overcome is the fact across all of healthcare in general, although we certainly have OAuth and there are security models that we use across the space, we don't have a model that basically allows us to scale across the ecosystem in general, right? So it's not that we don't have underlying security, we certainly do. When we talk about the dynamic world of APIs in which we need to build connections dynamically and be able to share information with the appropriate consent and security, authorization and authentication, the ability to do that at scale dynamically is really, really important. So the solution that we're going to walk through today helps enable that. And quite honestly, it's nothing new. The UDAP model has been tested at HL7 for a period of time. It aligns, aligns with the work that Commonwealth has been doing as well. And of course, can bring a solution from a FAST perspective that enables all as actors in healthcare to be able to share information, again, dynamic, trusted environment. So I think we've talked about the barrier. We talked about the solution we're going to cover in just a few seconds here. But again, when we think about what is in scope, what are we trying to solve, keep in mind, trusted dynamic, right? That's a key component there, using UDAP, and also JOT-based authentication and authorization. So as this information is moving, we know that the use of the information, the right of the person to access it, and those types of things. From a status perspective, this solution is actually well down the path. It's currently in the balloting process. So those of you that are active in the HL7 community are probably been involved in either reviewing it or potentially even voting on it. I think voting is going through September 15th, if my memory serves. And then also, since we're doing a kind of a high-level discussion today, in the documentation that we provided in the deck, each one of these solutions, you can double-click on the lower right corner and basically go into the solutions and do your own perusing and that type of thing. So I would encourage you, even after today's discussion, to make sure that to invite you, I should say, to looking at this information in greater detail. And as Paul alluded to earlier, joining us in the FAST community as we bring these complementary solutions together for healthcare in general. Next slide, please. So, we could spend hours talking about the registration, authentication, authorization model that is covered under FAST. In the interest of time, since I'm sure you don't want to hear me talk for 3 hours, we'll talk about just some of the key components. And I mentioned UDAP as a Universal Data Access Protocol as a as a model that we're using to provide that dynamic connectivity that we've been harping on since the beginning of the presentation today. Some of the key components of that are the client authentication using JOTs, the trusted dynamic client registration, again, the ability to connect in a trusted way between actors that basically are trusting the certificates and allowing the connectivity to happen dynamically. In today's world, typically the ability to connect relies on pre-knowledge of everything that's happening with endpoints. Paul talked about the directory, and although this is not the directory we're talking about here, the ability to have pre-knowledge of everything that's happening across the ecosystem with folks coming in and out, new functionality is not tenable at scale. So the ability to be able to trust and dynamically connect is very, very critical. Again, tiered OAuth, I mentioned earlier that OAuth is certainly part of the solution. When we're talking about cross-organizational use in a dynamic fashion, the ability to use tiered OAuth becomes really, really critical. Again, from a Connectathon perspective, we got a Connectathon coming up in a couple of weeks. This solution has been going through Connectathons for several years at this point. Much of the pre-work that was done has been brought together, aggregated as part of the FAST solution. It is going through the HL7 process. Again, it would encourage you, once you get the deck, feel free to click on those Connectathon things on the right side, the project scope statements, the implementation guide, check on how it's going through the balloting process, become involved in the solution. Because as this becomes more mature, again, since it's in balloting, it is becoming mature very rapidly, as the ability to look at these solutions in conjunction with what's happening with TEFCA, so that as we go forward with version 2, version 3 of TEFCA solutions, then we have the ability to make sure that we're benefiting from the work that's happening across the community and providing this dynamic access that we are really reinforcing in today's discussion. Okay, if we could go ahead and go to the next slide, just to quickly bring folks up to speed on what is happening through the HL7 balloting process. As you can see on the right side, there's a lot of check marks because there's a lot of work that has been done in the solution over the last several years. Again, it is actively in the ballot process. With voting ending on September 15th, then going through a reconciliation process. So again, if you're interested in security and how this contemporary approach to dynamic connections interests you, certainly dive into this, get educated. And then as we can use this across the healthcare spectrum in general, that will be something that we can all benefit from. Next slide, please. All right, Paul, I think I'm going to kick it back over to you to talk through identity.
Sure. You bet. So I mentioned, and we'll head to the next slide here. I mentioned that it's important for two parties to agree on which patient they're working on. Currently, our industry, as you all know, not saying anything here that's a surprise, there's a lot of matching in every time we do a transaction. At the start of every healthcare transaction, there's a lookup, and you try to make them a probabilistic or deterministic match. So what the barriers that we want identified here again is in the middle of an API, a transaction, it's not very dynamic if you have to stop and try to resolve identity. So absent a national identity solution, we need some mechanisms to make that more efficient and faster and have rules of the road for what party A and party B will do. And the current solutions around this are listed in that solution link, as Patrick pointed out in the bottom right-hand corner. Next slide. What we did was, rather than trying to boil the ocean around identity, since it's such a large topic, and many, many organizations are working on joint identity projects across the industry, we tried to envelope and invite many of those folks to the table. And we started to identify a vocabulary to talk about how to do identity or patient management in the midst of a transaction. Don't have a lot of opportunity today in the interest of time to go through all these, but we ranged the types of matching that are done based on complexity. They start with a collaborative matching pattern where party A and party B start a transaction, and usually it is the recipient of the transaction that's responsible for making the match or declaring, I don't know. All the way to the right-hand side to number 4, which will become eventually in our industry over time, digital identity mechanisms that are self-mediated by patients. We all have cell phones, we all use distributed identity, and healthcare, you'll start to see more of that. So we started to put a vocabulary around that. The work we're focusing on right now is really in the middle, how to mediate and manage identity within a trust network. And this is highly connected to that security piece Patrick just talked because in some cases, the OAuth ID can be used to mediate the matching for a patient, especially if you're in an agreed upon pre-established trust network or activity. So where we are right now is we are moving one project scope statement and an implementation guide through HL7. The project pages are on this link, and what we're doing tactically right now is looking at the dollar match operation within FHIR and in HL7 and identifying additional data, additional rules of the road to be able to make the matching capability more dynamic under networked or mediated kinds of third-party match scenarios. So we're making the problem a little bit better as we go, and would expect this topic to continue to expand and grow as we get more trusted entities out in the implementation ecosystem for FHIR. So that's in a nutshell what's happening within the identity space. And if you're interested in that topic, the links are here to engage in that work. Now, another piece, we go to the next page in an intro here that Patrick's going to talk about is you mentioned TEFCA. One of the concerns around how to scale FHIR is how to do intermediary exchange or hops. And since we have that in prior art around traditional profiles in IHE or traditional X12, how do we do that in FHIR? And how do we make the FHIR grow quickly over time? So I'm going to hand it to Patrick to talk about this very important topic that answers some of those questions that have been posed in the TEFCA conversations.
Yep, and thanks again, Paul. Appreciate the setup. And to Paul's point, one of the critical things that was in the QTF was, so a little bit of a discussion around, hops or intermediaries and those types of things. So again, in the spirit of, bringing solutions that are happening from a fast perspective along with other work that's happening in the industry, we're going to spend a few minutes talking about the work that's been done to basically enable the facilitation of, FHIR or closely associated, could be CDS hooks, could be other types of complementary technology, typically RESTful types of interfaces across intermediaries, right? So again, very, very timely in the sense that, the work that's happening from the QTF perspective and the work that's happening from a fast perspective are hopefully over time going to come, very much aligned in the sense that the solutions that we're bringing can be used across the ecosystem and vice versa. So the solution that we're talking about here, what are we trying to solve? Because, when we get into the discussion of what an intermediary is, what does the hybrid model look like? Let's quickly define, when we talk about an intermediary, what that means. And in this space, when we talk about an intermediary, it's basically a service, an organization such as an HIE, such as a clearinghouse that is providing value add, to the connectivity model and basically connecting different actors in healthcare, right? We see this pattern in other industries, and we've seen it in healthcare for many, many years with the examples that I've already provided with HIEs, with clearinghouses, from a payer provider perspective. So that model exists, and we think it's going to continue because there are value add services of having those intermediaries as part of the mix, right? We also recognize that, the basic pattern is point-to-point communication, in which you have one actor that needs to interact with another actor. So you activate a service, you either get information or you request information, you share security. I talked about that a few minutes ago. And then you're able to share data. But again, if you're going through an intermediary, you need to have the same experience and not have to have pre-knowledge of how to negotiate or interact with an intermediary. So that's what we're trying to solve with the solution. As far as what's in scope, again, it's basically routing across intermediaries in addition to point-to-point communication. So that's the work that the team has been hammering on for a couple of years now. We do have a draft implementation guide is going through the final stages of the HL7 process. It's currently scheduled for ballot in January of 2022. There are weekly meetings that are happening. So again, a shameless plug, if you're into intermediary routing, with FHIR transactions, feel free to join us. Maybe Melissa or somebody else can drop the link into the chat. We actually have a meeting later today at 1 o'clock, right after this meeting. And again, like I mentioned before, double click on the current solutions, because in this overview, we can't go into all the details. So Paul and I are doing our best to give you a good overview, but again, do some self-discovery on your own as well. If we could go to the next slide, I'm just going to quickly mention that the solution that was brought forward by the FAST Tiger team and has been brought into the HL7 organization and is part of the FHIR infrastructure group, focuses on this intermediary solution. And I want to just call it a couple of key things on this. And when we talk about the exchange, we're talking both about synchronous transactions in which a request is made to a remote server that needs information immediately, right? Actor A needs something from actor B in real time, synchronous communication, and also asynchronous model in which, for example, in bulk data or whatever the case may be, in which an interaction happens, but the requester is not necessarily waiting for a response. It can check back later using a polling method or some of the other stuff that we have from a bulk perspective, but we want to be sure that we're supporting both asynchronous and synchronous models, because again, one of the architectural paradigms that we have, or guidelines, is that actors on either side of an intermediary should not have to have intimate knowledge of how the intermediaries work, right? It should be a black box in the sense that if there's intermediaries in play, they can facilitate exchange, but not provide additional burden on any of the actors to be able to share information. You're going to see that when we talk through some of the use cases that we tested. We also, the hybrid environments, we've talked about that a little bit. Melissa, if you could go to the next slide. What that basically means is that we completely recognize that point-to-point communication is the base architecture, right? In which you've got, up in the upper left corner, the blue provider talking to the, I guess, blue payer on the right side as well, slightly different shade, but they're doing a point-to-point communication. Totally valid interaction pattern, right? Matter of fact, it's the most prevalent. But you also have actors in healthcare that for either technical reasons or business reasons route their information through a clearinghouse or an intermediary, HIE, whatever the case may be. There's a lot of different valid use cases. And our model needs to support both equally, in the sense that any of those actors that you see outside of, kind of in the circle around it, should not have intimate knowledge of how to negotiate with an intermediary or clearinghouse. They just need to exchange to what they know is a trusted endpoint. So if we go ahead and go to the next slide, let's talk about the work that's been done from a Connectathon perspective. And also, again, as you're looking through the TEFCA documentation and maybe providing comments or feedbacks, think about how these can potentially mutually benefit each other in the future. So the model that we have tested through, this will be our 4th Connectathon in September of this year, is basically how do we how do we show that we can do point-to-point connectivity and also route through intermediaries. And I could spend, again, a lot of time talking about this. I'm going to break it down just some basic points. The way the model has been tested is that we have actor 1, in this case, it is a payer, Humana, which needs to share in for which actor 2, another payer. If you think about the CMS regulation, that's, with payer to payer, that's why this one is so popular in Connectathons. But in this case, actor 1 first interacts with the directory service. That is not required for intermediaries, but as Paul noted on the architecture diagram, these solutions synergize with each other. So when we can demonstrate the enhanced, capabilities of bringing these together, we do it. But in this case, actor 1 had never communicated with actor 2 before. It queried the directory and said, hey, I need to interact with actor 2. The directory provided the endpoint back to actor 1, and actor 1 called that endpoint and said, here's my security validation. I need to do operations on your fire server, and went that way, right? Actor 1 never knew that an intermediary was working on behalf of actor 2, right? And the reason for that is using the model you see kind of in the lower right corner, the CMS Connectathon where it says DNS and app path approach, is that actor 2 had registered their endpoint, basically in the directory saying, if you want to talk to me, actor 2, then here's the trusted endpoint that you should interact with. Doesn't say it's necessarily an intermediary, doesn't matter. It's basically saying, this is how you interact with me. Using the DNS model, that endpoint resolves to an intermediary. Actor 1 doesn't know that. Actor 1 doesn't care. Actor 1 just knows that it is dealing with the trusted endpoint that has been asserted upon by actor 2. Could be one intermediary, could be 2 intermediaries, right? This diagram is fairly simplistic, but you kind of get the picture, right? And then we have routed basically a fire transaction across an intermediary. Actor 1 didn't recognize it, didn't need to know. It got a response back, and life was good for both actors. Actor 2 in this case had decided that they wanted their public interface or their public gateway to be an intermediary because of the value add services that intermediary provides as it relates to security or basically offloading some of the API management, whatever the case may be. It was a very, very valid use case. Now, quickly, just going on the bottom there, I know this is a bit of an eye chart, but you'll see, the different sequence diagrams that we've tested and we'll be continuing to test. Don't have time in this meeting to go through each one of those, other than to say the model that we have tested successfully in 3 connectathons and going on to 4 does include intermediaries and point-to-point. So as you're thinking about, how we move forward from an industry perspective, please consider this. And again, if you like the intermediary, space and have interest in that, please join us. You can see the connectathon, deep link, or I'm not deep link, but link in the upper right corner, the project scope statement, and also the draft implementation guide. So that being said, if we could go ahead and go to the next slide. I know I'm taking a little too much time here. Where we are in the process, again, you see some check marks in the upper right corner. Our notice of intent to ballot will go in prior to August 31st, and then you've got the ballot signups. I'm not going to read all of those to you, other than to say our goal is to get this through the balloting cycle in January of early next year, which is not that far into the future. So please join us if you can. And with that being said, I think I will kick it back over to Paul.
So let's, thank you, Patrick. So important point and linkage up to TEFCA. I think as we round this up, you can start to see and connect the dots between some of the work that our industry is doing in TEFCA and other quarters, other venues to move our industry and add API-based interoperability going forward. You can start to connect the dots between what the work we're doing here to provide the infrastructure standards to scale that and what we need to do so efficiently. So the summary here on this page is a one-stop shop for what we've talked about today. It's the master plan for moving this information from concept to implementation guide standard to implementation in the industry. The artifacts in the green in the middle are describing the implementation guides that are underway. And then the engagement on the bottom of the slide talks about who's engaged and where connectathons and other activities are that you can join. If you scroll ahead to the next slide, some additional content, you'll see the identity here. We didn't have a chance today to talk about testing and certification, an important piece, and versioning. We'll get there hopefully in future conversations. But the last slide here is your one-stop shop for engaging. So as you're linking our current B2B environment that's based in the traditional B2B standards around IHE and others, to now as we're all moving as an industry and adding FHIR to that as a RESTful API activity. I'm pausing just a minute to see if the slide moves forward to the next slide. I think we're just in a bit of a delay. There we go. So each of the key things we talked about today, exchange, the ability to register and authenticate the security pieces, the directory, and the matching pieces. Here are the HL7 project pages when the meetings occur in the work groups that are defining the detailed implementation guides and the chat streams. And you'll also find this work in connectathons. So for a lot of us working on this process, this is how FHIR will move forward. A lot of work been done across the industry to make that happen. And as we connect the dots between this work to TEFCA, to QTS and QHINs, to trust networks and other bodies that are already in production, I think we now have a pathway over the next few years to move to a scalable API infrastructure for healthcare. So pass it back to Stefan to round us up and talk about how you can get involved, because we really appreciate ONC's sponsorship and cover on this.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, we got you, Stefan.
Okay, great. So thank you again, Patrick and Paul, for walking us through all of that. Sincerely appreciate that thorough explanation on all the slides. Hopefully that resonated with a lot of the folks on the call here. The main thing we wanted to point out, to in addition of how to get involved on the last few slides in the specific work streams and the specific solutions, just from an overall FAST perspective, the best 2 ways to get involved is, number 1, click on the FAST action plan link that's underlined here on the left. This presentation will be going out as I understand it, so you should be able to do that. You can also click at the bottom on the FAST project page, that open Confluence page I mentioned earlier, and then on the right-hand side, there's a link to the FAST action plan. That is a living document that we keep up to date. Every 3 to 6 months, we look at what updates and modifications, edits we need to make to it. But it's a roadmap essentially of where to get involved, where this current status of the solutions are at, which ones are going which direction, et cetera. So to always click back on the URL, and that'll get you to the most up-to-date version of it. And then on the right, the second way is to join the LinkedIn group. It's a nice lightweight way to get involved and stay in the loop. You can sign up for the TLC's listserv. And this way, whenever we have an update to the FAST action plan, or if there is a new work stream kicked off for the IGs or announcement on the Connectathon work, a summary of how to get involved, we push it out on that LinkedIn group. We push it out to the listserv. And then that way you can kind of, stay tuned to what's going on there and get involved in those events as they come along. We even promote events like this Weedy Forum through that LinkedIn group. And again, we've got about 600 plus members as part of that LinkedIn group. It is an open LinkedIn group. So if you click to join it, you will be approved to be added to it. And if you send it to your work colleagues and friends in the industry, we'll approve them as well. And it's a place where you can not only ask questions of Patrick and Paul and others, but you can also have peer-to-peer communication in the chat feature. Next slide. I'm not seeing the slide advance. There we go. The last thing I wanted to mention on behalf of ONC is that I'm sure you're going to have questions related to TEFCA, and that some of this discussion has sparked interest about, like, oh, is that going to be used, or could that be used for TEFCA? Or I'm concerned if that's going to be used for TEFCA, whatever it may be, since that's where our next panel is going to be. I just wanted to mention that it is a little awkward for ONC to comment on that, since we are working with Sequoia as the RCE, and then they're handling all this. We're in an open public comment period for the Q and technical framework. That public stakeholder feedback opportunity runs through September 17th. Here's a link to that. So if you have any thoughts about connecting the dots between the FAST work and TEFCA, I'd like to focus and direct your questions there in your input to that place. That'll be the best way to formally get it considered and incorporated. And I'm sure that the panel will touch on some of this in a little bit, but really wanted to thank all of you for the time today to talk through FAST. Last slide. And just mention, I know we don't have Patrick on the slide because he was going to do it, and then he had a conflict, and then at the last minute he's like, I can do it again. So we were lucky and able to have him on here, but I don't think we got to add him back to this last slide. But feel free to contact myself or Paul Oakes as a chief architect. And again, there's another link to that project page. So again, thank you very much. And at this point, I'll turn it over to Weedy to decide about how to handle any questions if we have time.
Well, thank you, Stefan. That was great. And Paul and Patrick, a ton of information here. And I think particularly for the Weedy audience who's been working their whole careers on the exchange of patient information, this is pretty relevant stuff. One question I wanted to ask, I know at the upcoming Connectathon that you guys mentioned at least once, and for anyone who's interested, I believe the registration closes August 30th. So I guess maybe it's too late, but in any case, with things like UDAP and identity management and patient matching, are there prototypes yet out there, or are there active kind of pilot projects going on? Or are we still in the kind of nascent phase or transitioning into it? So if people in the audience are out there want to start working on this, what's the best path?
Yep. So I'll take a first cut at that. John, that's a really good question, by the way. So, if we look at, for example, some of the work that's, it's been done with Commonwealth as it relates to UDAP and security, you've got some things that are becoming real. Within the Connectathon, you always have test apps and those types of things that, can certainly, bring, examples and functionality to life in a sandbox environment. The same is true, I guess, from an identity perspective as well. Some of the work that we're going to be doing in September with vaccine credentials and other ancillary or closely related identity things, I think would give folks a good flavor of where this stuff is going to come real. And also, I'll just throw Exchange out there as well, and directory, because we do have, solutions. For example, CAQH has a directory solution that we test during our Connectathons. You'll get a good perspective on there, and also eHealth Exchange participates in the Connectathons as it relates to routing across intermediaries. So I don't want to be too grandiose and say everything is in production, but there are some fairly lifelike examples that occur in either the Commonwealth space, for example, or in the Connectathons that are real real organizations, real solutions that are testing. with software that may not be in production, but is, running on their sandbox environments.
Right. Yeah, John, one other add to Patrick's comment. I've heard in the past that maybe fire is not ready, therefore we shouldn't worry about that. What we're doing here is making fire ready. We think that's a better approach. It's going to be a very effective tool for our industry to scale. So the way that happens is for all of us to actually dig in and participate. I think X12 Wheatie demonstrated that in the early go, busting barriers and making that protocol work, and look where we are today. So encouragement here to participate in connectathons, not as laboratory activities, but as test and learn. That's how we get better. That's how we learn, and that's how we move it forward. So definitely a thing for people to sign up for and digest and help advance.
Thanks, Paul. We got a couple of minutes before the last panel, so I'll throw one other question since you just mentioned Wheatie and the early days. I think there's a question really relevant that gets asked a lot within Wheatie events. I think I've heard you talk a little bit about how do these standards coexist together, right? We have X12, we have Fire, we have HL7.
Yeah.
Do you want to, when you look forward, how do you see this all playing out?
Sure. So we have another talk we've done in the past, and maybe we can pull that forward in the future. But if you look at where we are today, for example, I'm not going to be exhaustive in my example here, but just for example, we have, for example, NZ-PDP standards that handle a lot of the detail around pharmacy scripts. We have X12 standards that are shepherded by the industry and Wheatie to handle administrative transactions that are encapsulated within regulations. So we use them. And now we have HL7 standards that have moved from a B2B kind of process to a API Fire-based process for the exchange of clinical data. That's always been the piece that we've always wanted to scale across the industry, not just between focused care delivery organizations, because there's a lot of phone, there's a lot of fax, there's a lot of things happening for treatment and payment operations in that space that if we could automate and reduce provider burden, it would be a real win. So all of these things are going to coexist together. In fact, many of the work groups I just mentioned, HL7 Fire, NCPDP, X12 Wheatie, they all work together. So this will be a journey, but right now, let's focus on the big picture. We got a lot of paper and a lot of fax and a lot of burden and a lot of people talking to each other. Let's automate that at scale using Fire for the clinical data exchange.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Paul. It's a great answer. So I think we're going to start our transition over to the other panel. We're speaking with three folks, Hans and Tim and Danielle, about kind of perspectives on TEFCA. I think that there's still a lot of questions. We're in the middle of a comment period. When we think about TEFCA and think about interoperability, and Wheatie has been smack in the middle of it, one could maybe argue that the first point at which the public sector and the federal government and HHS put their foot on the pedal was literally with HIPAA, accelerating the idea. We called it administrative simplification back then, but it was really founded on using the kinds of digital transactions that were used in other industries. The phrase back then is, how can we make healthcare look like an ATM? And how could we apply those principles from other industries to healthcare and make things better, faster, smoother, take out the friction in information exchange? As we all know, here we are over 25 years later, and there's still a few transactions that were in that mandate that haven't been implemented. Along the way, we had high tech and ARA and meaningful use, and a number of places where the federal government has gotten into the mix to try to move us all along with carrots and sticks. And I think with TEFCA here, we have, Mickey Tripathi had indicated last week at the Wheatie session, I believe it was on Wednesday, that TEFCA, we're looking at this as a voluntary participation thing, but that it's designed to be a baseline set of methods and protocols where all of the stakeholders in healthcare can move along some of those use cases that haven't advanced as quickly as we wanted them to. So with that, we're going to engage the panel here. maybe the first question that we'd like to ask is, given that context, where we are, we've been maybe almost 30 years working on this. How ready are we to take this hopefully last and final leap for kind of a national network that can engage all the stakeholders? Maybe Tim, maybe you start with you.
Sure.
You're
Okay.
doing some great work up in Mayhem in your little part of the country. So
I'm Tim Fletcher, Executive Director for the Michigan Health Information Network, Mayhem. You know, I think people have really not fully celebrated the success of HIPAA from an administrative simplification. A lot of times people talk about how great claims data is, how poor clinical information is. And a lot of that is because of the discipline that went into really standardizing on a national scale. And you know, the ability to validate transactions, to understand rigorously what good quality data is. You know, it wasn't a happy accident that that data, while not perfect, is of very high quality. It was a design feature. And so I think as we go into TEFCA and think about the sort of brave new world that TEFCA is embracing, you know, I think we have to be equally disciplined on making sure we have high quality usable data and usable information. And so I think we are focusing a lot on sort of the, hey, just share the data, don't information block. But, you know, I think there's plenty of more room here, because the devil's in the details on this stuff. We need to put the expertise in place that sort of WEDI helped pioneer to really focus on the quality of the information that gets exchanged beyond just sharing the data. So I think we have a long way to go on the quality and the usability of the information. And we still have a lot of emphasis on kind of just getting the basic connectivity to share the data. Which TEFCA is a good start for.
So Hans, Tim mentioned the quality of the data. You're one of those folks out there sitting on mountains of it. How ready are we for this? And where do you think the pathway is to get to the good quality data that Tim's talking about?
Thanks, John, and thank you for today's session. I think there's a variety of answers to that. There are mountains of data in a lot of places. Providers certainly have a lot of them, because that's in many cases, the source, the starting point of the data. But the data lives in a variety of other places as well, that depending on where you're at, may at times be a better source because it's more aggregated. It has already been harmonized, normalized, whatever. So I think we're looking at a plethora of data sources. And data quality, I completely agree with Tim, is that data quality is a key point moving forward. When you look at the progression of the interoperability from the early days, and that's not since FHIR, not since CCDA, not since HIPAA, but it is since organizations, the system started to exchange data, and particularly across, you see that individual organizations had solved certain problems for themselves with local data that did the job. But then as they started to expand, they connected with HIEs, they started to connect with other networks nationally, they started to connect in a variety of different ways. And what's really being amplified right now is that the variation in how individual organizations have managed data and the level of inconsistency, not purposefully, but because of the way that historically these systems evolved, is now coming really to the fore. Are we all using loin code or SNOMED codes or ICD codes? Increasingly, but not fully. And are we using it consistently? Is the same concept being expressed the same way so that I truly can compare? There's a lot of effort. I completely agree with Tim. A lot of effort to be done there to make that happen. I think the progression from HIEs, a variety of national networks, TEFCA, et cetera, is further amplifying that need. Or you look at immunization registries, or you look at electronic lab reporting in public health. Any kind of environment where it goes across organizations, that's a challenge. And how do we deal with that? So yeah, that will be a challenge that will continue to be there. to line organizations. We've seen that multiple organizations implementing the same system can end up in a variety of different places with configuring it. How do we deal with that? And a network or a framework, a trusted exchange framework, can help with moving that forward as well. Because as you look at different networks of different sizes and focus, one of the things that they typically have started to work on, and at times also struggle with, is that since we're trying to share at that level, how can we improve the data set that is then to the benefit of the participants? We're just making that picture bigger. It's like the glass is half full. We're just making the glass bigger, and it's still half full. Still a little bit of work to be done.
So I as the policy person on the panel, Danielle Lloyd from AF, I'm going to take it up 50 levels from what Hans just said, and start with the fact that I think from the payer perspective, the good news is that when you think about it from a cultural perspective, I think there is broad agreement about the value of it, right? The technology is only so good as the buy-in when it's a voluntary process, right? And there's an understanding that there are that there's value to the ability to better access data, to be able to exchange it more easily and more efficiently, and potentially really further impact outcomes. When you think nationally, the payers, their participation in HIEs, for instance, is quite variable across the country. But this notion, especially for national payers, of really being able to connect more broadly is something that's of great value. But I do think it's hard to sort of put an average or a broad swath on the payers in terms of their readiness. I don't think our legal counsel would want me to officially answer that, but B, it's variable across the country. Not everybody has Paul on staff, right? And it's also, that there's so many open questions around it. It's hard to say, what you don't know what you don't know, right? And what can you be ready for? Because we only have pieces of the puzzle at this side. But I think the bright side is a lot of the payers are part of HIEs, which I guess we can't call it a leg of the stool because Sequoia, I think, has an umbrella, but maybe a spoke on the umbrella. It's a step in the right direction with this. And the payers who are in federal programs, are now putting out these patient access APIs and these directory APIs. So they're growing accustomed to what the US CDI is, and thinking about, again, the new use cases that can be helpful to them, like the exchange of clinical information between the providers and the payers. So that, I think that's where we are at this point.
Thank you, Danielle. I'd like to maybe you raised a couple of things in there. One, kind of the maybe from a motivational aspect, and another just from readiness. And I know it's fair not to want to speak on behalf of everybody in the payer industry, but kind of looking at things of where were we, where are we now, and where are we going? On the buy-in part, I think if we go back to the early days of HIPAA, and administrative simplification is really a euphemism as why do payers make life so hard for providers? Back then there was a little bit of, significant amount of adversarialness, let's say in the early to mid 90s. We were also introducing this idea of managed competition and all that stuff. So I guess a two-part question. One is, from the point of view of, that adversarial world of the 90s to the point of view of value-based care, where payers and providers are theoretically sharing responsibility for a shared customer, kind of where are we there in terms of the motivation to exchange information? And I think generally speaking, from a readiness perspective, if payers are motivated, do you have any sense of what your membership is telling you about the level of lift industry-wide that payers are going to have to do to take this next step?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, we do consider it a different day and age. And as you pointed out, there's a lot of collaborative work going on in terms of the alternative payment model space, quality measures, et cetera. Just using the quality measures as an example, we partner with CMS with a multi-stakeholder group of providers and consumers and employers, et cetera, on trying to align quality measures. And it only gets you so far to align on the quality measure itself. Now we have to figure out how to reduce the burden by exchanging it more efficiently and electronically, right? So I think, you know, that is a multi-stakeholder group that has sort of buy-in on, you know, what the next steps are, that is collaborative, right? And so it is a little bit different at this point. I do think that, you know, you know, as I was getting at with the value to the payers, right? This is one of those sort of it takes two to tango situations, right? You know, and that's where some of the payers have problems with participation in some of the HIEs. You know, it needs to be that the payers are giving and the providers are giving in terms of this relationship. And, you know, the payers see an opportunity here to more easily obtain and electronically medical record information that's going to support, you know, their justification for risk adjustment in certain cases, you know, for the quality measures, for audits, right? Monitoring fraud, waste, and abuse, for getting larger data sets to do trend analysis and risk identification. So there's a lot the providers, that the payers see as value. And then with that, right, the providers can seam up. If we're all, you know, doing electronic prior authorization, we're all going to be better off. You know, so there's really finding that balance of how do we more efficiently do some of the things we're doing and see value on both sides. So I think it's taking a different approach and a more collaborative approach.
Thank you. Tim, Hans, any thoughts on either motivation or readiness here?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think in terms of readiness, you know, I think we all have appetite. I think, you know, I think we might be one of the few HIEs in the country that has sort of all of the health plans in our space participating, right? Like over like 23 different groups, you know. But I think the issue we're trying to get to now is to have our national health plans be able to do it the same way across the whole country versus having to do something special in Michigan. And so I think the opportunity that TEFCA creates, I think, and I think Danielle said, really, the appetite is there now for folks to do things on a national scale. I think that we have to still be very use case focused on a national scale and drill into very specific things that show that the folks on each end will both get value. And things like prior authorization, you know, the Da Vinci use case that's sort of lined up there is a perfect example of where we have to sort of leverage TEFCA's larger framework to do something specific and concrete. And I think we are ready from an appetite perspective. We sort of have the master legal framework. You know, the current pieces going forward are kind of more on our legacy technology base in terms of they're not really yet using FHIR, and yet these new use cases that we really want to do and where their appetite is there are expecting FHIR. And so I think what we have to do is sort of transition the bridge from that sort of legacy space where, you know, the old engine stuff is kind of functioning into where that appetite for multiple stakeholders to do things. You know, essentially, I think COVID taught us that it's not all about the EHR, that we've got to kind of get social determinants of health. We have to sort of expand the footprint where even HIEs are really trying to make the transition from, you know, health information exchanges to sort of health data utilities in a very different way. And so, you know, I think we are all ready to come to the party in a way that looks at the big picture. But I think what we need is very concrete focus areas or use cases to create value. And I think as long as we get that lineup, we're very ready for organizations to move forward.
Thanks.
I
Hans?
think what Tim indicates that's visible in what are the current networks and what is TEFCA aiming to build on is that you look at the treatment purpose of use. There is a good amount of sharing going on under that umbrella. The moment you go into operations, it starts to get a little bit more challenging. But indeed, if you look at the use cases and line them up, where are the ones that there is increasing appetite and interest, and where is there still some work ahead of us to build on the collaboration? When you look at quality measures, when you look at prior authorization, there is more clarity, more alignment already in play to say that's the appropriate data set to be used in those exchanges. The more you go to the more open-ended type of data exchanges beyond treatment, that's, I think, where there's still further work to be done to understand how do we keep track of that? Are we sharing it appropriately with the right parties from a patient, from a provider perspective, et cetera? So that balancing, as I think Danielle also mentioned, that's still work in progress. But if we compare where we are today with where we were a couple of years ago, that has taken some significant steps. A framework like a TEF or a TEFCA, once the common agreement is finalized and the QTF is going to contribute to that. There are going to be elements to that it provides a more clear legal framework consistently, so you don't have to work through that as much. But then within that, the technology frameworks, the use cases, they need to be then further worked through to make sure that the ones that are ready, let's move forward on those. The ones that need some work need some additional attention.
And if you mind if I circle back on that, I think I missed one part of your question in terms of the level of lift, but some things that Hans and Tim said circled me back there. But I think part of it, as Tim said, is focus in terms of level of lift, right? We have to be making sure that we have very particular use cases and that they're staged thoughtfully, right? And the payer industry has a lot going on right now in terms of not only dealing with the pandemic, in terms of trying to get more people vaccinated and all sorts of great work there, but also spent a lot of time and resources from a health IT perspective on telehealth changes and now the interoperability rules, and right. So it's really about sort of a methodical approach in terms of making this doable. And I would also point out that the level of lift may be a little bit different on the plans that are in federal programs versus the commercial payers. And some of the commercial payers are also in federal programs. But when you think about the FHIR work that interacts here, the plans in federal programs are the ones that currently have requirements to start moving down that path to FHIR and APIs and the like. The commercial payers aren't included in some of those rules. Now they have their own work that is going to be difficult and time consuming in terms of the transparency and coverage rule and some of the IT resources and such that are required there. But you might see a differential between a pure, let's say, commercial plan and a pure MA plan that's already been moving down the FHIR pathway. The last thing I would say is, I think another good example that sort of gets at some of what Hans was saying is, the plans, generally speaking, give providers data to run their alternative payment models, but everyone's doing it point to point and everybody's doing it differently, right? Like Tim was saying. And so the question is, right, can we be doing this in a much more efficient way that is far more consistent for the providers, where again, we're all going to gain something by taking that step.
So Danielle, you just brought up the word use case. I think Hans kind of used it. if we go back to way back in the beginning, the root origins of what is now TEFCA out of the Cures Act, and the root origins of a lot of interoperability, David Brailer had indicated kind of 4 primary use cases. One, that doctors needed to start capturing data in a structured way using EMRs. 2, that doctors should be sharing that info, or providers in general should be sharing that information with each other to support patient care. The third one being that data should then become available, and this kind of moves into your domain a little more, Tim, with for supporting looking at populations. How can you make decisions and policy around populations of patients based on data moving? And the last one being really engaging the patient. Now, the CMS rules have gone way down the road now in the last 24 months to engage patients. Where do you guys see, in terms of TEFCA, does TEFCA fit into all of those use cases? Is it sequenced? I think maybe Daniela, you had said, do we kind of stage them? Where do you guys see TEFCA really getting at those use cases, or maybe some of the others that you guys have in mind?
I'll go first. I'll just say I think TEFCA is poised to take the data out of EHRs and push it somewhere else. I think if you sort of listen to Mickey, and there's a lot of getting the doctor's information. I forget which ONC director talked about data liquidity, but really just trying to get that data out, right? And I think that we've learned since Dr. Brailer's time that that getting it out is insufficient. You need to get it out in a way that you can put it back in and use it, and that increasingly you need to get it out and share it. And as we move into value-based care and we move into sort of population health, it's not get it out for a referral from one physician to another, but it's really get that data into a system where best practices, clinical decision support, other tools that require automation can really add value to reduce the burden on doctors. And that piece of the equation is not fully addressed in the current TEFCA model. It's still pretty much focused on sort of getting the data out and swapping it around at the current point, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, it's an interesting area, because I think that TEFCA long-term has the interest to cover the variety that you highlighted with Dr. Brailer, and there are others. But it has a couple of, and it has some steps that need to be taken, and it's not totally clear right now what is the sequence. So when you look at some of the documents currently shared, certainly the purposes of use are wider than just treatment. There is a larger list in play there, but which ones to focus on first, second, third? There is a focus on document exchange, which is much more indeed about querying for documents. And with FHIR, there's questions about what should the next step be. But if you take that progression, it is intended to move from a query to otherwise. If you look a little bit about some of what the current HIEs and the networks, national networks are doing, I think you can see some of the other flows that TEFCA is intended to start to encompass as well, by part of aligning on a legal governance trust framework, as well as consistency in the technology standards that can enable the flow. But agree that in the early stage, it's much more on the query. There is another interesting part of, I think, TEFCA as well. And I apologize sometimes saying TEF separately, because it encompasses the common agreement and the quality, the QHIN technical framework. But that entire framework is not only focused on EHRs. I think with a variety of programs that we have seen, and actually as ONC started originally, it has been around HIT. Even though the focus has been narrowed over the last 15 years or so around EHRs and getting access to the data. But I think you see with TEFCA and the use cases being brought in, it is more HIT. It is the interaction with payers. It is the interaction with public health. It is the interaction with research. It is the interaction with other HIT that has data or needs data to do what they do best. So, and I think that is one of the more interesting aspects of well, that we are starting to look at it more holistically, so that we ensure that it's going to come down the right data at the right time for the right patient in the right hands of the right stakeholder, that they can do their job, they can participate, they can make their own decisions as consumer much better. I think that's what ultimately TEF is about, trying to enhance that. But there are clearly many steps to go before that's all in play.
I would, I think that list is actually fairly durable, over time. But there are some additions, as Hans and Tim were getting at. I do think that when you think about it, it's not just about collection in the AHR, right? For instance, the collection of race and ethnicity data could be something that the plan collects at enrollment and then shares back with others. So there's other sources, right, of data and such. I think in terms of the meaningful use aspect, I kind of laughed to myself. I remember doing an NPR interview at one point and them asking me to explain meaningful use. And, for common people to be like, it's not enough to have it, you actually have to use it, just really sounded silly, to a broad audience like that, like, duh. But it's complicated, right? As we well know. So that, that is true. It's like, and that's part of the point I was making with the 2 to tango, right? Is, we can't build something on one side and not have it used on the other side, right? There's that issue of buy-in, and sort of the system all has to be sharing and somewhat equally. But I do think that's where some of the federal policies can come into play, right? Of, some exchanges being required, obviously, is a big enough stick to get things moving. But I do think on the patient side, for us, the payers are really concerned about the fact that the way the interoperability rules are set up for the patient access API, where the patient is, gives their consent and information is sent directly to the third-party developers, it pushes everything outside of HIPAA. And that gives us really, great pause, and is not something that we think in the, 8 pages of terms and agreement kind of thing, people are going to notice. And, chances are it's you use the app or you don't. There's not, any way to really control any of that information. So in some respects, we think maybe that sort of started too early. And, if it's through the TEFCA construct and there are privacy considerations on everyone who gets the data, that might have been a better way to go about this, right? And so I think that's back to what I was saying from the beginning, was the staging of this and really having a broad vision of all of these different federal policies and all these different state policies and all these different standards, which are not just, by the way, fire, but thinking about, again, NCQA accreditation, for example, thinking about, how do we stagger these different use cases and make this not only doable, but where they sort of build on each other, and not have sort of false starts, if you will.
Danielle, you raise a really, I think, important point, specifically for our WEDI audience, given our history and orientation. This idea of the privacy and security and the challenge, or in some cases, people considered it a threat, of giving things over to third-party app developers who were not covered under HIPAA and who were only covered under federal trade areas. What is the view? How do you guys view this? Is TEFCA really about covered entities exchange information? Are we able to rely on TPO a lot more and things like that, familiar concepts, or are we dealing in TEFCA with some of the same issues and concerns that people have on privacy and security with the third-party apps and the rules?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you think about the patient access API as an example, right? there's not really even an agreement between the third party and the payer. There's maybe they have attested to some, privacy code of conduct or something like that, but there's no way for the payers to constrain in any way how that information is used. And once it's outside of HIPAA, right, it can be bought and sold as long as it's somewhere in that 18 pages. And so I do think, I think there is some, in the absence of sort of federal privacy law that extends to those types of entities that are not covered entities, if you have these common agreements that gives you a place, right, to have some sort of legal hook on those actors. And I think when you think of the long-term use cases, we can't just think of this as covered entities, right? It's going to be broader. It needs to be broader, especially if it's going to be patient engagement aspects of it, right? And, so I think this is one of those areas where we really need to be thinking about the relationship to state laws, where states have more stringent privacy policies and data moving across states with different rules, right? It's not just the feds. And it's different, right, for part 2 than it is, for substance use than it is for other type of data, at least for now, until new rules come out. So it's a pretty messy area, and not one that we have 100% answers, but we're definitely concerned and think there might be a better way to do this.
And perhaps to add to that, and looking at one of the questions in the chat there as well, there is definitely a clear question on privacy, consent, security of data. It's also very clear from the intent of the variety of acts and privacy rules that the patient, it's their data, they get it, they can do with what they want to. So there's a big educational question around that awareness on how do you do that so that there is that they can make decisions that they like to do. But and that line that there has been that approach to date that hey, we have to be very careful where the data goes. At some point in time, it switches into the environment of the patient, and they have to right. How do we manage that? So clearly agreed is that there needs to be clarity around that, and how can we do that best? Is that code of conducts? Karen has established one. There are other organizations that may be working on that. There is how do you avoid having 10 pages of agreements that it's hidden away. So there's a lot to be worked out. But in the meantime, there is that transition that we have to manage with that providers and payers alike are effectively. You come with and I know for sure for the providers is that you come with an app. You have to be able to have a reasonable opportunity to connect that. So lots to learn, and how can we make sure that everybody is aware of how data is allowed to be used, is not allowed to be used. And I believe that TEFCA is going to play a role in that as well, where connections are made, where there are flows that run through TEFCA. We'll have to discover and work together to understand how can that be used to enhance the comfort level, the trust, the first tier of it, not only among providers, not only among payers, not only along those already part of HIPAA, but also those that are not part of HIPAA today and that have effectively a very important responsibility to manage data on behalf of their patients. How can that be done in an appropriate way? So I'm hoping that TEFCA will help in that way to raise that trust level for everybody, including consumers, so that the questions Danielle raised, which are important and concerning, but that we can tackle that as well.
Thanks. So go ahead. Yeah, I'm sorry, Danielle.
I hate to, interrupt there, but I do think, another example is the payer-to-payer required connection in the interoperability rules. That is potentially part of TPO, right? But in the same respect, we don't really know where this is going to land, because we're expecting sort of a rebooted interoperability and patient authorization rule, but there may still be required consent there. So it's with each of these policies, there's sort of layers, and each of the policies to some extent are a little bit different and have to be treated differently within this context. So it just, again, gets more complicated. But another example of organizations that aren't just apps who might be really beneficial to connect to these are the community-based organizations with which the payers are working in terms of social determinants of health and equity. In certain cases, payers now have actual outcomes-based agreements with the community-based organizations to help improve the outcomes of those patients. So they're not, strictly providers in the traditional sense, but certainly ones that are going to need to know if they're arranging, Meals on Wheels for you, et cetera, whether or not you need a heart healthy diet or a diabetic, related diet or, whatever, just to give, some examples. So, there's so many different things that we still need to think through.
So Danielle, I'm glad you keep kind of looping back to this idea of examples or use cases, because one of the things that I think we know from WEDI, HIPAA didn't try to boil the whole ocean, right? It picked 5 business processes. It said, let's solve these, and that'll dial the noise way down. And in order to solve those, it took the revenue cycle management processes, broke them down in a highly granular way to specific data elements. I'll call them the barter components, right? For providers and payers to actually do business, they have to agree on a set of data elements around which they'll build all their policies and contracts and procedures, right? So that is an approach for really supply chain integration and automation of business process. So Hans, you had mentioned documents, right? So I'm not sure that everybody here kind of understands the distinction you're making between this kind of granular data elements on one end and documents on the other. And when I listen to Danielle, when she talks about some of those use cases about Meals on Wheels, and that kind of lends to the idea of a provider exchanging a document, a presentation of the patient, versus automating some of these things that have to happen between payers and providers or payers and other people, which is around automating a business process. Can you guys talk a little about that distinction between documents and data?
Sure, but I'm happy to jump in first for a moment. I think there are a couple of key concepts there. Is that you have the individual data, collections of data that are important for a particular purpose, be it a workflow, prior authorization, or the management, results reporting, etc., that are needed for that. But you kind of, and between quotes a little bit, you just care about the data to manage your process. A document was conceived to be something somewhat different in that it is a snapshot, effectively, of a set of data that is relevant to the author of that document at a point in time. So very good examples of documents are discharge summaries, referral notes, consult notes, operative notes. They're very clear sets of data in a particular flow, pathology report that they're organized, et cetera. That's really the intent of a document, to tie a set of data together for a particular purpose by a particular author. That's the original definition. Then came CCDs, as CCDs came around. And that came around, and that really blurred the line a bit between those documents and the rest of the data. That it's a great way to get a variety of data across, because the individual transactions, the individual messages were very focused on particular workflow process steps, did not include everything. They only included what was needed for that. And here we had this document construct that I could just toss everything in there. So I think what you're seeing right now is that there's a wide use of CCDs to be able to get that larger data set across. And you still have all those great documents like referral notes, discharge summaries, etc. So I think what is happening here, and a great point, John, as we're moving forward, is that we need to look at both. We have the need for workflow support, that at a particular point in time, somebody needs to communicate, adjust the data set to then continue to work somewhere else or inform or otherwise. But I still have this document concept as well, a snapshot in time of that's the data set that's relevant in that context. How do we, and that's just sharing, no workflows that are necessarily triggered off that per se. We need to manage both. If you look at TEFCA right now with the QTF, it is very much focused on the document exchange, on that sharing of snapshots. When you look at the proposal in there about the message delivery, it starts to get into the workflow. If you look at other scenarios and use cases as we're going to see them, and fire comes around, or you look at what has been happening for case reporting in public health among some of the networks, you start to see more of that workflow in there. If you look at the WEDI environment with the transactions, it is all about transactions with mediaries that are in there that documents may be supporting. So it is a very amorphous flow. And tapping into one of the questions, the reason why I believe that TEFCA is document centric is that is in that environment a proven technology that they can progress, where some of the other ones are either still in maturation, like fire, or they are already dealt with in other places, that prescriptions, claims, otherwise, there are already places there where that happens at this point. Is that the right place for TEFCA to replace what exists or build on what is there?
I think, TEFCA is very technology infrastructure. It is very document centric, just as Hans said, and it is less focused on sort of solving certain problems or use cases. The use cases are sort of very general that TEFCA is sort of set out to be able to do, enable query-based exchange. They're very broad kinds of things. And I think that's fine. But I think what has to happen in order for folks to really, it's a voluntary infrastructure. So in order for folks to really get the value out of this, they're going to have to identify specific value creating use cases that communities of interest can come around, very similar to what the fire accelerator programs have done, and target specific activities to be able to show what this looks like end to end. And I think that as long as we don't get lost in some of the legacy pieces that are document centric, I think we'll be just fine. I think that a lot of people are investing in fire. I think they got very, very invested for the 21st Century Cures Act requirements. And now I think they're kind of looking at this space. Maybe they're not very good at handling CCDAs. Maybe they're not very good at the SOAP IEG protocol stack. And they're wondering, do I have to do all that, or can I just stick with fire? And I think the answer is there's going to be a lot of legacy IEG SOAP protocols for how a big chunk of healthcare works. And I think that everyone should probably lean into fire as much as possible, but that they're going to either need to rely on an intermediary or recognize that there's some chunks of the healthcare ecosystem that are probably not going to be on fire overnight.
And it's interesting that TEFCA as a framework has opportunity to grow and cover a number of things. Clearly, document exchange is the first one to get feet on the ground and move that forward. But if you look at another example that where TEFCA may be borrowing from over time as well, it's not only necessary that we need to, I think, and that's going to be feedback to ONC as well. Don't only think of it as a trust framework and a technology framework per se, but at times being a trust framework already can achieve a lot. That can enable other workflows to start to run under the umbrella. So you're increasing the efficiency of connecting the dots. A good example right now is that with the public health case reporting that was really important for under the COVID pandemic. Effectively, the combination of eHealth Exchange, Care Quality, Commonwealth, other networks that are in play, it was possible to create a legal framework very akin to the Common Agreement that enabled communication directly with APHL for case reporting. Nothing flows through the physical network, but the trust framework was there. And that allows speeding up some of those connections. So I think, yes, it is today focused on document exchange in a brokered fashion, but that need not mean that TEFCA, as it takes on new use cases and fire and otherwise, that everything is only about document exchange, or that we could not have unbrokered, or that we could not have other technologies. In the submission of case reports, it's a combination of either direct or XDR using a CDA-based document that is submitted. And that's the technology that is capable, but it just goes directly, lowercase directly, to APHL, not through a broker.
Yeah, I think
doesn't have to.
I think Hans' point here is really important, in that people are modeling QHINs after what they see with eHealth Exchange, and TEFCA framework is set up to contemplate very different models than we see with Commonwealth and eHealth Exchange and Care Quality. So I think it's entirely feasible that you'll see brand new services show up as QHINs and operate. TEFCA as a framework is designed to be able to accommodate those new models and those sources of innovation under the RCE in a way that I think could produce very unforeseen and very scalable opportunities to do more, potentially differentiate from what we're all thinking. So I mean, I think the TEFCA framework itself is incredibly powerful for being able to do more things. And I think Hans said it really well. It is a trust framework. A couple of the questions have gone by and said, well, what's the enforcement framework of that trust? And I do think that experience will tell us how to go about doing some of that better, because there are some unanswered questions there. But for right now, I think it is a really good mechanism for us to sort of bootstrap, those first stages of data liquidity and begin to solve some of these use cases.
So Danielle, listen, go ahead. I'm sorry if you have a comment. Yeah,
I was going to say, I might just try to put that in a little bit simpler terms, and then Hans and Tim can, correct me, because I suspect that not all of our audience is, quickly facile with CDA and XDCR, or whatever it was, right? The reliable exchange. I think of this as more of individual elements that are standardized, or collections of elements that are standardized, and not to be confused with the notion of sort of a structured and unstructured document, right? We've had problems in the interoperability rule as an example of what to do with, 500-page PDFs. If there's one element of the US CDI in there, do we have to figure out how to get through there and pull out that's one standard piece of information? And CMS has said no, right? So there are absolutely challenges, sort of the structured, unstructured data, and at some point maybe we'll have natural language processing and be able to pull things out of that. But it's really more about sort of packages of elements. So I think of a quality measure as an example. There's a discrete quality measure. There's discrete information that it needs for the numerator and denominator, and it's a package of information that the payer is asking for the provider, right? In that respect of a document, if you will.
So thank you. There's a couple of questions in here. Getting to the point that you touched on, Tim, is kind of TEFCA versus FHIR, FAST versus TEFCA kind of thing. I'm hearing this kind of data versus documents approach. How do you advise people to look at this? And I think, Danielle, you've got at least a couple of hundred payer constituents out there and I know my own personal work, I work with a lot of them trying to, deliver technology to help them support patient data exchange. They're all over the place in terms of sophistication. So what should people be thinking of? I'm kind of hearing that it depends on where you are and what you want to accomplish, how much of your bet you're putting on TEFCA and how much of your bet you're putting on FAST. Can you talk a little bit about advice you might give people in that situation, making decisions about, staging things?
Yeah, I can. I think, from the payer state, stakeholder, the sort of non-provider organization specific space, I think you're going to keep following the rules, right? I think 21st Century Cures Act rules, things that they're put in place to comply with the rules are going to drive you towards fire, and they're going to drive you towards use cases that solve problems. And so whether it's Gravity or Karen or Da Vinci, that's where that space is going to go to solve and continue to simplify administration. As a source of clinical data from traditional document-centric spaces, I think the first pieces for TEFCA are going to be coming from those avenues. Where I think what will happen is, the good thing about the US is there's lots of innovation. I think the RCE will be challenged from the sort of narrow framework of care equality and Commonwealth and eHealth Exchange as the list of QHENs, to basically folks who can meet those requirements, but who are there with very different business models. And I think those business models will be focused on creating value in different spaces. And I think that, because one of the TEFCA tenets was really to embrace market and market competition. And I think that you saw, even if you've listened to Mickey speak at different times, he wants to leave a lot of things to the market or encourage the market to come forward with solutions. So I think folks need to stay focused on doing those things and participating in those things that create value for their organization. I think that's why it's voluntary. But I think as you find those communities of interest and you get these clusters of value, which are going to be more use case centric and less data centric, I think you'll see momentum begin to pick up in those places. And then I think you'll see more rules come, and that'll probably have more teeth because you'll see ONC doing a piece. And then I think you'll probably also see CMS kick in. And when CMS kicks in and ties money to functionality, then the world moves along in faster increments. So that's what I say, is to stay focused on the value, comply with the things you must do, and then sort of force folks to sort of clusters of value. And to the degree that you like what's going on, roll up your sleeves and jump in, because this will be a national community effort to sort of solve for some of these problems.
And in that progression that Tim outlines is that having a focus and a look at fire, how it is evolving, it has the opportunity to get for a variety of use cases the right data set, be it in document format, be it a document reference, be it a set of data. It has the ability to move that direction, but it has still some maturation to go. So when the questions are, why are things documented, etc., there is opportunity in a variety of different contexts to work on using the fire Lego blocks, if you will, to pull things together as they fit the use case at hand, and still have a very consistent data expression. One of the other questions, how can we standardize across the board? Things expressed in CDA don't quite look the same as in version 2, don't quite look the same as in NCPDP, etc. It actually has the opportunity that for all those variety of use cases to begin to arrive at a common expression of the data, and therefore build in that level of consistency that we need to make it predictable, transparent, usable, plug and play, all those kind of things. But it is a roadmap, it's a process. It's not all day one.
Yeah, I mean, I would just reiterate one thing, right, in terms of, the requirements, right? Again, the federal programs from a payer perspective have a different set of requirements than the commercial do. And the payers in general don't believe that they are subject to ONC, Cures Act, information blocking rules unless they fit the definition of a HIN. And most of them estimate that they don't fall under that definition as it's currently written from the CMS side and the payer side. They put in a proposal for TEFCA to be required. They took it out, I think, largely because we just weren't there yet. Maybe that'll come back, but I think as an industry, we're sort of hopeful that, as Mickey put it, that there'll be enough buy-in voluntarily without federal sticks, because the payers see the value of it, right? And the proof's in the pudding there. We don't know yet. And certainly, compliance and governance issues are a real question right now of whether or not it's worth it for a payer to participate in terms of the benefits outweighing the risks in terms of the compliance that are not so clear yet. And I think we can all agree to the fact that this is not going to go seamlessly. There will be hurdles along the way. So I do think one thing we need to be thinking about collectively is, this notion of kind of a good faith efforts and transition plans, and the FAQ process and that sort of thing, because it's not going to be perfect right off the bat. And I think if the payers feel comfortable with those aspects of the rules of the road, then and see the value, that they'll come in, and hopefully without the regulatory sticks. But I do think that we talked about sort of prior auth, maybe medium term, partially because there's again this reboot rule where we're not really quite sure what some of the policies are going to be there yet, and we have a standards attachment rule theoretically on the quarterly review list, but who knows, could be been waiting for Godot so far, right? So there's a lot of questions there. I think we placed some of the quality stuff at a little bit longer term, but I think the sort of fast value to some extent is going to be replacing some of the areas where a plan would have requested and paid for a version of a chart, right? And that's part of where I think, the looking through for information to justify risk adjustment and, other information is going to be valuable to the plans. So again, there's a lot to be seen.
Thank you. So we have just a couple of minutes left. I'm wondering, any last thoughts, since we're in a comment period and the people in the audience are going to be starting to wonder about, oh my God, another thing to think about over Labor Day. Any last thoughts on what the folks in the audience should be asking themselves or others?
I'll go first and wrap up. TEFCA is good. It is a step in the right direction. We need to encourage it to land into the right place. The second thing, and I saw quickly pass through, it's absolutely correct. Fire and TEFCA are not at all incompatible. We didn't want to say that. But what we did want to say is a lot of folks have not invested in some of the initial technology base that TEFCA is sort of promoting as part of its framework, and they have invested in fire. And so, what we really wanted to do was set expectations that, could you stay on this fire path? Because there's a lot of learning. The act of being part of RESTful APIs is very enabling from a technology infrastructure perspective. Could people stay in that world and control their own destiny? And I think the key thing is possibly not. You may have to sort of back up to catch up with some of that document pieces if there's particular components of value there. But do not take your foot off the gas pedal on any of the fire stuff, because the consumer component and the sort of better access to the information that's more granular is definitely clearly where most of us are placing our bets.
Yeah, I'd say is that the purpose, the goal of TEFCA is where we want to be, where we have a consistent trust framework and a consistent minimum predictable set of technologies to access exchange data, growing over time from not only document sharing, but other ones as well. And it is going to be important that as it evolves, that it builds on capabilities that we have a good experience with, and that need that extra nudge to get wider acceptance. And it also needs to have the opportunity to find new ways and better ways to access and exchange data and enable that as well. while at the same point in time as it emerges that the community that operates in part in TEFCA and in part in existing capabilities, how does that all work together? So it has a couple of challenges ahead of it, but I'd suggest to focus on what are the basic core principles that it's trying to achieve, and how can we move those forward using TEFCA and its complementary capabilities that we have out there to build that trust, to build that common technology platform as a starting point, not as a ceiling, but as a floor where we can progress and mature and evolve. That's how I would look at TEFCA.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, you know, FAST and FIRE are enablers of a successful TEFCA, right? They're components. And I would say, you know, one thing is we really need additional payer and other participants to really engage in the FAST work and the Da Vinci work or Argonaut, depending, you know, on who you are, because the more that we get worked out there, I think, again, the more value there's going to be, and the more successful we're going to be within the TEFCA construct. But I do also want to say, you know, most of the people on here are probably generally familiar with TEFCA already. I think we need, you know, sort of now is the time to start sharing some of these materials with, you know, more of the technical team, with your policy teams, with your legal counsels, like distributed out, you know, broader in your organizations, because it really has sort of cross subject matter expert implications, right? To deciding, you know, when and how to join and how to, you know, implement this well. There's, you know, great information on the ONC website, and Sequoia project obviously has information up there, and lots more coming imminently. But by the time you know, want to comment more on, you know, common agreement and such, you don't want to go to the legal counsel to review the common agreement, and they don't even know what TEFCA is, right? So I think some of it is getting that homework done so that we can really hit the ground running with all of this.
Well, thank you so much, Danielle, Tim, Hans. I think it's been a great presentation. People stayed very engaged throughout the whole hour. I found it interesting, and given the questions we got, I think a lot of people did. So again, thank you very much for your participation. We really welcome the great thoughts you shared with us today. And on this idea of FIRE and documents and granular data, on September 9th, we'll have Rick Geimer talking about CCDA to FIRE conversion, which in Tim's world, I think he's probably going to be dealing with that on a daily basis as we go forward. So thanks once again to all. Much appreciated. Have a great day.
Nice job, John. Thank you very much.
Take care. Thank you.
Thanks.